Okay, so I think we can start. Fantastic. So thank you everyone for joining us on this webinar under the 28 for 28 webinar series on COP27, Action and Ambition 1 year later. My name is Raidan Al-Saggaf, and I'm the economist at the United Nations office in the UAE. We know that COPs come and go, and tomorrow is the 28th meeting of the Conference of the Parties, which kicks off here in the UAE. And I'm sure that you're all very busy with ongoing work associated with COP28. However, we thought this webinar is important as a reminder on what COP27 has achieved and how can we build on its successes under the Egyptian presidency and accompany the UAE's COP28 presidency. Last night, I listened once more to His Excellency Sameh Shukri's opening remarks at COP27, how he illustrated the challenges and his approach to managing the multilateral process, the geopolitical headwinds, and also the commitments needed and ambition of having an African COP. On that note, I am pleased to have my colleague, Dr. Scott Stanley, my counterpart in Egypt, who has worked closely on this endeavor, join us in this event. Before I give the floor to Dr. Stanley, I'd like to remind you to post any questions that you might have in the chat. Scott, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Raidan. I hope everyone can hear me. Let me first thank the UAE RCO, my counterparts and colleagues for this invitation, and also wish everyone congratulations for the year and best of luck for COP28. It is an exciting moment, as I recall from last year. I think this was a very good idea. I know that everyone is very busy. The moment before COP starts is very hectic and intense, but I do think this is a very good idea to reflect on the past year, where things stood exactly a year ago, what's happened ever since, and then we can start to think about what that means for these next 2 weeks and also beyond. I think it's quite important to have this reflection exercise in order to see where we can emphasize our own work, both to maximize COP28, but then our contributions to climate action after. Let me, for my intervention, I'll just be speaking. I was taking this idea of the reflection quite seriously and went back, similar to you, Raidan. I did not listen to His Excellency's opening remarks, but I did review some of the outcome statements from the documents from COP27 to really refresh my memory about that moment, and then to take that forward over this next year to see what has happened. So some of the major breakthroughs, a lot of the enthusiasm for some of those activities and initiatives. What has that meant over the last year? So I think I have a two-part intervention here. One will be looking back at some of those COP27 outcomes, and then with a brief update on where we are exactly 1 year later on the eve of COP28. So I hope to bring us from last year in Sharm right up to the present day. I have 3 areas. This will pick up some of the selected negotiated outcomes. I think, as colleagues all know, there's a lot that comes out of a COP process, so this one I'll pick up on everything, but some of the key items that I think are particularly relevant as we enter another COP. This would be maybe the most prominent outcome from last year, of course, the loss and damage fund. The language around the 1.5 degree target, language around energy transition, agreement on just transition, and then adaptation, and the call for international financial architecture reform and MDB reform. After that, I will go into a few of the non-negotiated outcomes, because I do think, particularly here in Egypt, we are quite interested in the follow-up to some of the flagship agenda items that were put on the table last year by the Egyptian government and then launched. And so here I will pick up 3 in particular. The first would be the Egyptian presidency initiatives. So this was their flagship action agenda. I think quite similar in a lot of respects to the UAE action agenda this year. The second will be the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda, which was accomplished through the leadership of the climate champions. both COP26 and COP27, and now a collaboration between COP27 and COP28. I think this fits the idea of the sustainability over time, which is clearly one of the big takeaways that I have over the last year is about how to ensure a lot of these initiatives have a longer lifespan than one presidency or one COP cycle. And then last in this section would be the Early Warning System for All initiative, spearheaded by the Secretary General. My last section will be a little bit, a few words on climate finance. I think, as we all know, this is central to everything else at COP. It runs through every discussion. I believe my colleague Radon might pick up more on where we stand on many of the financing issues, but I'll pick up a few points that I wanted to highlight. So with that, let me go straight into the negotiated issues, and I'll start with loss and damage, as this was certainly the headline, I think, from last year. Following COP27, there was what was known as a transitional committee that was mandated for bringing recommendations for operationalizing the fund to COP28 for discussion and agreement. This was a split between developed and developing countries and chaired by South Africa and Finland. After 5 committee meetings and several technical workshops, ministerials, they arrived at outcome text that will be presented at COP. I think that it is safe to say that it is a challenging negotiation, and that most of the observers would say it is or most of the participants also might say it's a compromise text, but there is a text for discussion. Let me highlight 3 of the issues I think that were most heavily discussed over the course of the last year, and where it landed as we go into COP28. So first is on the host of the fund. And so the text recommends that this would be in the World Bank for an interim period of 4 years, with the possibility of transitioning into a standalone fund after. There has been a lot of discussion on the source of the financing for the fund, and in here the language does not. The language arrived at for discussion does not delegate any requirement for contribution from any specific countries. So it does not, for example, require financing from the traditionally high emitting countries. The differentiation in the language now is between the developed countries that are it's encouraged, I believe. Sorry, one second. Right, it's urging developed countries and encouraging other parties. It's a very, very important distinction. But there is nothing that is involuntary at the moment. The third piece is on country eligibility. Here again, this would be about accessing the fund. In the end, the language keeps the language from the agreement from the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan. And this does not exclude any countries. There is an expectation, so it's around countries that are particularly vulnerable. There's still some discussion around what particularly vulnerable means, but at the moment it does not mean that is restricted to LDCs and SIDS, for example. There are clauses in the language that there may be a stipulation for a floor for a specific percentage floor allocation for LDCs and SIDS, but at the moment there is no clear exclusion of any countries. This was a big discussion point, especially related to middle-income countries such as Pakistan and whether they would be able to access the fund. As we go into COP, I think I would make 2 points on the loss and damage discussions. I think one, clearly there will be more discussion around the technical details, but I think here at the UN we are also talking about the in some ways an elephant in the room on this, which is the actual financing of the fund and the contributions that may come, and the focus on that this needs to actually be financed. And this will be one of the key key discussion points and the key hopes, I would say, for COP28. I believe the EU has signaled an expectation that they will announce funding during COP28 for the loss and damage fund. Let me go now to 1.5 degrees and actually energy transition, which ended up, I think, in quite a similar position, which was to essentially reiterate the text from the Glasgow Pact. So on the 1.5 degrees, this is the language is that it reiterates that the impacts of climate change will be lower at 1.5 degrees compared to 2. And the key text is that it resolves to pursue further efforts to limit temperature increase 1.5, which is the same as COP21, or sorry, COP26. And on energy transition, similar pickup of language, specifically on the phase down of unabated coal power and the phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. I wanted to pick up here the link, I think, to the Global Stocktake technical report. I think, as everyone knows, the Global Stocktake will be, in many senses, a frame for COP28, and a very important input that will likely inform declaration and the final decision. COP27 was at the halfway point, and it was still in the midst of the technical discussion. And now that the technical phase is finished, I found the synthesis report that was released in September, I think quite sobering, especially when you think about the relation to the last two topics that I just mentioned. And this was that this narrow window of opportunity to limit to 1.5 degrees is closing very fast. And there were some very sobering statistics in the GST synthesis report about what would be needed to maintain 1.5 degrees by 2030. And I think the estimate was a 43% reduction in emissions, and that current policies, if continued, would only be a 2% decrease. And I think that this puts in a pretty clear perspective about the challenge that we're facing and the need for, let's say, urgency and scale, as a lot of my colleagues like to say. Let me turn now to just transition. The last year's COP27 cover decision did include what I believe for the first time the call for a work program on just transition. This was picked up over the last year by the subsidiary bodies, and I believe there will be the first high-level roundtable held next week in Dubai. Next, on adaptation, there remains the call for doubling finance for adaptation. Again, I think some sobering statistics that have come out recently in the OECD's recent climate finance report that found an actual decrease in adaptation financing. It's now 27% of all finance. Another midpoint exercise last year in Sharm was on the work around the global goal on adaptation. What I will say there is it was a framework was released for the final year of work with the hope and the mandate that the work would be completed this year. Here I'll also note that the GCF's second replenishment cycle, which is still ongoing, which I believe is about 9.2 billion out of a $10 billion target. And so there was a hope last year in the cover decision about replenishment of the GCF. There are several other things several other important issues in the cover decision, of course, which it would be great to have a discussion about anything else that colleagues on this call would like to discuss. But let me move to the non-negotiated outcomes, some of the key ones, I think, especially from the Egyptian perspective, related especially to their action agenda. So here we have the COP27 presidency initiatives. So these were, at the time, 14 flagship initiatives that were launched across key climate-related issues. Each of these was in partnership with a development partner, primarily a UN entity, who co-led the development and then since last year, the implementation. A couple of things I would say here. They are quite a disparate group. I think they have different purposes, different scopes. Some are regional, some are global. All of their over the last year, they have gone at proceeded at different speeds. I think COP28 is a very important reflection moment, I think, for the future of some of these initiatives. I think there are, I believe, 10 that are still active. Some have been merged together over the past year. Some maybe didn't get as much traction as others. And there will all have, in some form or another, a moment to reflect on implementation, build partnerships, et cetera, at COP28. I won't go over all of them, but let me just mention 3 that I think are particularly relevant. So the first is also relevant to the negotiated outcomes, as I'll mention. The FAST initiative, the Food and Agriculture for Sustainable Transition. So this is led by FAO, who's now the Secretariat. Germany, the German government has signaled financing the first 18 months of operation, and there will be an inception meeting at COP28. I point this initiative out also in the context of the new Sharm el-Sheikh Agriculture Work Program. So this was another important outcome, I think, from the negotiation side, which was the extension of the agriculture work program for another 4 years. The work has been proceeding over the last year again, and will be picked up next week. The second initiative would be what is known as AWARE, which is Action for Water Adaptation and Resilience. Here again, I believe last year's cover decision was the first time that water action was picked up. This initiative is led by the World Meteorological Organization, WMO, which is now the Secretariat. They have 6 different work streams, all aimed at essentially battling water scarcity and increasing safe water supplies. The first steering committee meeting was held a few weeks ago at Cairo Water Week, and there will be, as similar to FAO on FAST, there will be several events related to AWARE over the course of next week. I think primarily on reflection on implementation, planning for the future, partnership building, and resource mobilization. The final that I think is quite interesting is the not to say the others are not interesting. This is a particularly noteworthy, shall we say. In the interest of time, I won't go over all 10, which is the Climate Resilience and Sustaining Peace. Now, again, I think I'm highlighting these because these are some of the maybe breakthroughs on new items that came out of the COP27 cycle. And here, this is focused on the nexus between climate, peace building, and conflict. It is anchored in the Cairo Center for Conflict Resolution and Peace with the support from the Conflict Security Mechanism of the UN. It has quite an extensive work program on capacity building, training, partnerships, knowledge, etc. There will also be an implementation review at COP28. Here I wanted to link one important point, which I alluded to earlier. These are some of the initiatives that launched from that agenda that are, let's say, the faster movers, and also what seem to be the more sustainable ones, and that is the key. I think there's always the risk at different, not only in the COP process, but in general from regular summits, workshops, etc., of the launch of a lot of new initiatives, often with overlap, and how they are sustained over time, how they can build off of each other, I think is always one of the issues. Is that there seems to be a proliferation of often, let's say, complementary initiatives and programs. So one of the things that we have seen are the ones that have lasted the longest are those that are working very closely, I think, with other partners, with a wide range of partners to build on what's already there, avoiding that idea of duplication or replication, and then also with a very strong institutional home. This is one thing that's very clear from our side. I think the three that I mentioned have a very strong anchor that seems committed over the longer term for follow through. And so this home of the Secretariat has been a very important factor, I think, in a lot of these launches. The second piece on the action agenda is the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda. So this was an initiative spearheaded by the climate champions, both of COP26 and COP27. It has 30 targets on adaptation and resilience across 6 different systems: food and agriculture, human settlements, infrastructure, water, coasts and oceans, and health, and then with financing and planning as cross-cutting issues. They will launch a 1-year implementation report along with several other events at COP28, and it will also add that several of the flagship initiatives from the Egyptian presidency have also been integrated into this framework. Again, on this issue of sustainability, not to belabor what might be an obvious point, but one of the key things here is it is now this collaboration between COP27 and COP28. And so with the aim of having a longer lifespan beyond this Egyptian presidency. And so here again, I think when I reflect on this past year and I reflect on, as I see things happening for COP28, and all the different events and the different initiatives and reports, et cetera. And it can often seem overwhelming, and I see a lot of things that are quite, to use a euphemism, complementary, let's say. And so I think I have been very keen on this idea of the focusing on making this type of work as effective as possible, so that things don't get lost in the excitement of a one-off event. Let me close before I turn over back to my colleague Radon, just a bit on financing. I won't go into too many details because I believe, Radon, you might pick up on where we stand on some of these issues. I wanted to highlight 3 things. So first is the high-level experts group, which was initially a collaboration between COP26 and COP27 presidencies. It's chaired by Nicholas Stern and Vera Songwe. Last year, it released a report that kind of gave an overview of the landscape for climate finance, including the scale and the nature of the different forms of finance, and costed out the needs. This expert group has been, the mandate has been extended, and now collaboration, I believe, between both COP27 and COP28 presidencies, and aim for releasing another report with recommendations, next steps for delivering a new framework for international climate finance. So I think that the aim is that this brings together a lot of the discussion around climate financing needs, what is needed for scaling up, recommendations for reforming the international financial architecture. The second point I wanted to make here is on the $100 billion annual commitment from developing countries on climate finance. I think it's well known that this has never been met, and that there is the discussion around the new climate finance goal with the expectation that this would be in 2020, come out in 2025 as a follow-up, building on the $100 billion commitment. I do want to refer back to the new OECD figures, which I think are the most recent. Of course, there's some discussion around methodology, et cetera, but just to take those figures as a guide of where things stand. For 2021, it was 90 billion, close to. And there is an expectation or an estimate from the OECD that it might pass the $100 billion mark in either 2022 or 2023. That's an estimate based off trends, but those figures are not yet verified. I do think it's useful, though, to break down the type of financing and the distribution. So 3 points here. One is it's very clearly still driven by public resources, which I think the OECD is now estimating. This is all for 2021, which is the last year they have full data. 85%. As I said, still mitigation is the main recipient of the resources. I think 60%, adaptation 27%, and both mixed, the other 13%, and then also very critically the distribution between loans and grants. So I think it's the figures from the OECD are about 70% loans. So these are still very much debt inducing. And I think this, if I reflect back on some of the discussions around financing of the loss and damage fund, this is very central. Is about how much of this would be debt incurring, how much would be grants. Particularly crucial question in the context of responding to climate emergencies, reconstruction, etc., with the risk of this being adding to what in many cases is already unsustainable debt. Let me hear. I will close with just a few words on the MDB reform, which was also, I believe, the first time in a cover decision where this was picked up. This has been a very active discussion over the last year. I think if you have followed international fora over the last year, this has been central to a lot of the discussion. We look back to the Paris new financial pact from last summer, the Secretary General's SDG stimulus, the statement at the SDG summit this past summer. The World Bank has embarked on its evolution roadmap. So here I did want to just highlight a couple of things on what this would mean in practice. And I'm drawing here from, I think, some of the from the vision from the Secretary General's adaptation agenda or acceleration agenda, specifically on the international financial architecture and MDBs. What are those key things what does this mean in practice? And so a few points. One is a lot of this always comes to scale. So this is about the scale of renewable energy finance. The discussion around the tolerance for risk, the discussion around phasing out financing fossil fuel projects, and then as I mentioned before, scaling up adaptation finance, and then finally on reforming incentive structures. Thank you for your time. I will stop here. I know, thank you for the indulgence, and maybe I went on a bit long. There is a lot to capture. I think everyone who's involved with COP28 knows that it is a massive undertaking, not just logistically, but also in the amount of content and outcomes. And so this captures a slice, let's say. But what it would be quite interesting to hear from colleagues, I think, where are some of the key issues as you are about to embark on this these next 2 weeks. How does that fit maybe with some of the key outcomes from last year? How can this be built upon, etc. I think I'd be really interested in hearing this dialogue and hearing from all the colleagues in the proverbial room, the virtual room. So I'll stop here, turn it back over to Radon. Thank you everyone for the time, and thank you, Radon. Over to you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Scott, for that exhausting and somewhat overwhelming description. You've summarized a year of multiple complex work in 20 minutes, so that's that has some magic to it as well. So maybe to recap on a few key critical areas is that, first of all, we have to understand that this is a negotiation process where every voice is equal and it requires consensus among all voices. And this is somewhat unique because in the UN system, we do have the General Assembly, we have the Security Council and other instruments, but there isn't a single mechanism that is to this level unmatched, requires consensus. And consensus necessarily means that all negotiation agendas come to the forefront, and there is a lot of push and pull until we agree eventually on the least common denominator. And when we track the cover decision for COP27 and potentially COP26, we try to follow where is that minimum common denominator coming? What direction is it taking? And I'm happy to say that actually there is some progress. Scott, you mentioned many of those examples in terms of the cover decision having some additional emphasis. We touched on the energy transition. For instance, how did COP27 came to, I recall, a breaking point for Alok Sharma in terms of what is the expectation when it comes to phasing out, phasing down, abated, unabated fuel emissions, what happens to coal, etc. And then taking that negotiation process forward to COP27 and what to expect at COP28. That same direction will continue, but I think we are likely to see some more progress on that. And this is the nature of a negotiations process. But when we take some of the key challenges, like, for example, emissions, which is the topmost issue affecting our planet, and we have a look at the UNEP emissions gap report, which goes to say that over 80% of all emissions in the world are the result of the G20. So therefore, you have a handful of high emitters who are actually causing a significant issue in that regard. So does that mean that the mitigation agenda is relevant to a few countries, not others? And how does that translate into the negotiations agenda? This helps us in looking at the impact of non-negotiated items. So every presidency has its own list of non-negotiated items. We go, for example, to COP26 with the Global Methane Pledge, which continues after that to try to mitigate and reduce methane emissions, given how damaging they are for the planet. And then we see what progress is happening along these lines. Similarly, at COP27, we saw a handful of non-negotiated initiatives. Many of them had a regional emphasis, like for Africa, and a COP for an African COP for Africa and for the world, and therefore trying to accelerate some of those projects. We also capitalize on strengthening the relationship between the UN system and the COP27 presidency, thanks to Scott and your team's work and other partners, to try to accelerate progress on key issues. We heard from you on the AWARE program and AWARE on FAST, on other related areas. And I think a lot of that work will have to find ways of continuing beyond the life cycle of the COP27, COP28 presidencies, and even beyond that. So that is something to think about, that we do also have non-negotiated items that can help us make progress on climate action. The key sticking point is not really on mitigation, because we do see progress on that in a significant way. And I suspect we will see also further progress on at COP28, for example, when it comes to introducing renewable energy, tripling renewable energy and other related matters, and improving energy efficiency. The key sticking point is on adaptation. We were hoping to have a global goal on adaptation as a result of the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program. Now we have a framework for that goal. That framework has some potential targets that can be particularly useful in terms of shaping out adaptation, where, for whom, and how do we accelerate that adaptation. We know that from the Paris Agreement, and actually from UNFCCC's agreement about the common but differentiated responsibilities, and in terms of how do we expect a lot of the financing flows to help uplift and support countries, especially in the Global South, to improve their adaptation to a warming planet. Regrettably, the situation on financing adaptation requires a giant leap forward when it comes to leaving no one behind. I do hope that COP28 will also build on the success that COP27 has done. Obviously, the key landmark was in relation to the Loss and Damage Fund. We've had 6 meetings with the Transitional Committee trying to figure out the details in terms of how can we mobilize and operationalize this fund. It's now a political decision, and we do hope through the negotiated process we will have a lot more to report after COP28. But it is a process that will have to continue beyond that to COP29 and further. One last key item is that none of this would be possible without financing, and we do see some support coming from different countries and for a stronger and more robust engagement on adaptation, rethinking some of those instruments. We know that preparations for the next quantifiable goal on financing goal would require a significantly larger envelope of support beyond the 100 billion target. And how will that come about? How will we benefit from the existing national policies like the Inflation Reduction Act, the EU at 55, and other related instruments that will help accelerate and make available resources for such a transition. That remains a big question mark, but it also helps us zero back to what can COP28 deliver that will help us build on those key issues. Last but not least, just to flag one specific element in relation to the financing flows. We do have a number of approaches to address this. For example, the Bridgetown Initiative and other language that can be introduced in managing the reforms of the multilateral development banks and international finance institutions to include clauses and some elements that help us mitigate the negative consequences of debt-based financing, especially in such an environment of high interest rates. If you have another pandemic or another crisis situation affecting countries and their ability to pay, and not creating another debt cycle that can be somewhat damaging for what we're trying to achieve. So those are some quick reflections. I must say again that COP27 was actually a giant leap forward considering the geopolitical circumstance. And if we can turn to the chat to reflect on some of the questions that were raised, Scott. And I know that tomorrow we're opening COP28, so there is a lot of engagements that everyone has, so we will try to keep this shorter. I see a question on relation to expectations from COP28 from Dr. Al-Amoudi. There is some discussion on the use of technologies, satellites, and other related matters to help us better plan climate action. And there is a point of also extending engagement to a widest spectrum of partners possible, including religious leaders and other stakeholders. That also brings me to reflect on the role of the climate champions and the breakthroughs agenda by 2030. So we do see a wide range of engagements beyond the negotiated outcomes to help us operationalize, mobilize engagements. So those are some key questions that we've had. And Scott, over to you for any reactions.
Thank you, Radon. Let me just make a couple of points. One is a reflection on your very helpful intervention, and this goes back to the statistic on the G20. By coincidence, I just came immediately before this meeting from a session on the G20 presidency with the government of India and others on green transition and the just transition, and this was clearly front and center, I think, of that discussion. This figure of 80% of the emissions through those countries, and I think that this links very directly to your point on the common but differentiated responsibilities. And I think one of the participants, I think, said it very eloquently, and with the line that as the G20 goes, so does the Paris Agreement, and so that this doesn't work without urgent and significant action from those countries. And I do think it is quite a different responsibility than it is for others, just to go back to one of your questions. On the two points from the chat, I think I would absolutely agree on the satellites, and let's just say in general technology, and the importance for technology for I think both adaptation and mitigation. I think this has been an emphasis of a lot of many of the discussions around coming out of COP27 and beyond about the use of different technologies and the transfer of technology, and how important that would be for making real some of these pledges. I think that when we talk about finance, we also talk about the technology and giving countries access to the type of support that would be necessary to make, for example, to make the NDCs real or adaptation real. And then I think the second point on the engagement extending to religious leaders, I think I would just refer back to, I think, maybe where you started, Radon, which is about the uniqueness of this process and the engagement of different stakeholders. And I would be fully in support of that. And this is the issue of our time, hopefully only our time, not the future. But this affects everyone. And I think that things to bring to the table. Everyone has a lot at stake. And I think that learning from different groups, giving that voice, is a critical part of this COP process. And I know that this is discussed. This was a big point of discussion last year about the extension and the involvement of different stakeholders. And I believe, I presume it's the same in the UAE. And I think that this will be central to the COP process from here on out. And one of the things I've been thinking about is extending beyond from about the COP process, and it is about the climate action, right? And so we think about taking advantage of the expertise or the views of different groups, different stakeholders. This is much beyond only the negotiations, which is critical, but I think also about the action within countries and about how do we adapt to these changes? How do we make a more sustainable future? And so I think that and maybe this is part of our work is now we're transitioning beyond the presidency and kind of as a UN system, our support for the presidency to supporting Egypt on its climate journey, let's say, working with the Egyptian government and what that means for realizing the important priorities here on energy transition, on adaptation, etc. And so I think that I've always tried to keep in mind the bigger, I don't want to say bigger picture because the negotiations is central, but let's say the complementary picture, which is about actually seeing results on the ground within different countries. I think I'll stop there. Back over to you, Radon.
Well, thank you, Scott. There are just so much ground to cover. But I want to say that reflecting on COP27, I think and going back to the statement of of His Excellency Sameh Shukri, it has exceeded in many ways, I think, despite the headwinds. And I think more importantly, that COP27 had laid the grounds for a very successful COP28. You mentioned the G20 presidency in terms of its engagement. We saw recently the meetings between the heads of the US and China, which is always a prerequisite in a geopolitical world, which offers kind of tension to succeed on the international cooperation on climate action. And we do see promising results coming out of the different initiatives that COP27 has built on. And I do hope that we'll be able to continue passing on the mantle forward to keep our planet livable for future generations. So thank you all for joining us for this engagement. We will not have another webinar next week. You know why, it's COP28, but we will have a webinar later on, I think around the 20th of December, to reflect on the outcomes of COP28. So any last words, Scott?
No, just to thank you, Radon, and thank the UAE RCO team. It's been a pleasure collaborating over really these last 2 years. And I wish you and everyone in the UAE the best of luck over these next 2 weeks. And I am very hopeful for some important outcomes from COP28. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. It's inescapable. We have the global stock take and we have a bunch of other heavyweight deliverables. So we will do our best. Thank you. Take care.
Very good. Bye, everybody. Thank you.